Every election season, as Indians, we hear about freebies and we hear about welfare schemes. Together, they're now called the REVDI culture. If a certain party promises 1 lakh rupees every year to all women in the country if they're elected, because 1 lakh taken by the population of women in this country, which would probably make up about 600 million, into 1 lakh equals 6, followed by, well, many zeros. And those are the zeros that our brains are unable to calculate. How does a country make this money? This is a question we have to ask ourselves, because what this will cause is sheer bankruptcy. So if you haven't joined me before, very welcome to A Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and on A Questioning Mind we discuss all things policy and culture. Let's do this. On today's video, we will be discussing why we often miss the difference between freebies and welfare schemes, and why we get so excited by such schemes instead of being aware of the dangers that they pose to the economy. And while this sounds unflattering, we have to understand that all nations across the world employ some sort of welfarism, because no economy is truly completely market dependent or libertarian. So I've made 2 videos where we first discuss the burdens that such schemes, if not planned properly, can put on the government and why we often fall for them. And in part 2, we discuss the differences between freebies and welfare schemes. So welfare schemes as well as freebies have a lot of overlap. Now, in these, what happens is that whatever taxpayer money and government treasury is built is used to give out free material goods or services to a certain audience. Now, these audiences can be different target groups, different demographics, or the entirety of the people. And every political season, we see different political parties come up with different freebie schemes and welfare schemes to promise to entice us into voting for them. So this is why it's very important to be aware of the undue strains that this puts on the treasury, which is, after all, built through taxpayer money. So this is our money, and we have to be careful about how it's employed, which is why I've thought this is an important topic to touch upon today. So there are a few reasons why we are not able to really understand the cons, and we'll discuss the first one. Less planned policy that is into freebies causes bankruptcy even. For example, if the water department is due to give free water to the entire population of a state, how are we then to sustain this cost if funds for this are sought via the central government? Because obviously we're not charging the citizens for such utilities. What it does is creates a lot of routes for multiple middlemen to make money skim off the central government funds while it comes into a state, while it goes into a specific department, thus creating a lot of room for corruption. A more planned scheme, on the other hand, will aim to create wealth eventually. For example, subsidizing animal husbandry or agriculture aims to generate wealth, and this is something I've mentioned as an example in a previous video, so if you haven't watched that, I do urge you to go check that one out, where I mentioned how the government of Sikkim had basically done organic farming and had been successful with government subsidies to eventually start earning a profit. So the goal is to have a welfare scheme that either creates social equity or eventually generates revenue. And both of these are also tied together. However, if these are unplanned, there's a lot of danger to the economy. There are 3 reasons why we don't often compute these dangers, and we'll go into these today. The first one is that our brains are often unable to compute very large numbers. When we see the amount of money that a political party discusses as a freebie scheme. For example, if a certain party promises 1 lakh rupees every year to all women in the country if they're elected, we might be happy as women to receive a direct transfer of 1 lakh rupees, but we have to ask ourselves what this truly means, because 1 lakh taken by the population of women in this country, which would probably make up about 600 million, into 1 lakh equals 6, followed by, well, many zeros. And those are the zeros that our brains are unable to calculate. How does a country make this money? This is a question we have to ask ourselves, because what this will cause is sheer bankruptcy. This will cause our nation to be begging from the International Monetary Fund for loans, for a bailout, a crisis that we haven't been in since 1991, where the balance of crisis payments was avoided through restructuring our economy and bringing in liberalization and privatization finally. So we do not want that. This leads me to the second reason why we are unable to understand the dangers that these schemes pose to an economy. So because our brains are unable to compute large numbers, there is this latent idea that a government has infinite money. So every time we see how much an infrastructure project costs, we think of it in thousands of lakhs of crores, right? 46 lakh crores spent for a water treatment plant somewhere, 53 lakh crores for road development in a different state. So these are not the kinds of numbers that our brains typically compute, because we have no idea how many lakhs of crores are there in the economy, right? We aren't really looking up the GDP every time, the GDP, the treasury numbers, etc. every time we hear these calculations. So these are processed almost as invisible, non-understood numbers by our brains. So we just imagine that the government can come up with funds whenever. Unless the government was into money laundering, and I know there's a lot of cynics who will actually believe that, there is a certain way the economy functions, and we are not made of unlimited money. The money is collected through our taxes, so as much revenue as the entire population, which is actually a poor population despite our being a very large economy at this point. The per capita income of the population is still low, but also it is for the same poorer population that these welfare schemes are being utilized. By that minimal taxpayer money that is collected from a small user base. If you have missed my video on taxes, do watch it. I'm linking it somewhere over here. It's definitely a must watch. So coming back to this, taxes that we make are basically used for these schemes. So it's not unlimited. The government does not have unlimited money. So we must be very careful when these numbers are announced. Say a small number. So I think at one point the Karnataka government or a different state government announced 5,000 rupees for every church priest, or was it the Andhra Pradesh government? One of these governments announced a 5,000 rupee pension to the priests across the state. So if you imagine the number of priests and calculate per, a yearly sum of 60,000 rupees for each of these priests, how would the money be allocated to these priests? Where would this money come from? So unless any scheme has an eventual goal to create profit or bring parity, there is no way that these schemes are sustainable. They eventually cause corruption. And so unless these are well planned out, and as a citizen we have complete right to file an RTI request and then find out where this money is coming from, how much of it has been utilized. So not many of us are doing that, and it is a democracy which requires citizen participation, so we can find that out. So but this is certainly something that our brains need to start computing. The third main reason, and this is the most important one, if you've stuck around you will benefit from this. So the third main reason is that a lot of economics discussion in our country are often correlated with the American economics, even though our economies are very different. It's not just because of our culture, etc. It's just that the economy of the US functions based on them being the global reserve currency of the rest of the world, right? So the US uses the USD, which is the US dollar, which functions as foreign reserve for a lot of different countries. So there is trade, global trade, that occurs on the basis of two different countries. For example, trade between India and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia can often occur by using US dollars. So when the US prints money, what happens is that it gets diffused across the rest of the world. Whereas if our country were to start printing money, instead of just high liquidity, we would see hyperinflation. Just ask Zimbabwe or Venezuela, who have done this. So the currency is devalued to such an extent that you can have millions of the currency and you would probably be unable to buy even basics such as grains or bread. And so we cannot correlate completely different economies, and which is why economists based out of the US will have a completely different point of view as opposed to policymakers based out of India. And so a template from a different country should not be applied to another one, because these function in very different contexts. So this is a very important reason why we often get caught up in the excitement of freebies and welfare schemes and the benefits that they will bring to a population without truly understanding the dangers that they pose to our economy. If you've stuck around so far, I thank you so much for joining me today. Do stay tuned for part 2, which I will also link over on the end screen, where we discuss the differences between welfare schemes and freebies, which do often overlap, but you can certainly find some differences which will help your mind understand if something is going to truly bring equity or is just an enticement for an election season. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in a few days.